In this video, we are going to have a look at the new super zoom lens from Tamron, which is the 28-200 f2.8 to 5.6. Kia ora, good morning everyone, Richard here, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to have a look at the new super zoom lens from Tamron. This is the 28-200 f2.8 to 5.6. This lens is specially designed for the Sony E-mount cameras. And to do this review, I have also went and borrowed a copy of the Sony 24-240 from my friends at Auckland Camera Center so that I can do some direct head-to-head comparison between these two lenses. Okay, as usual, let's start and talk about the build quality design of these two lenses first. The first thing I noticed when I pick up these two lenses is that the Tamron is quite a bit lighter than the Sony. The Tamron is around 576 gram, while the Sony is 780 gram. So quite a big difference between these two lenses. The Tamron is about maybe 1/3 or so lighter than the Sony. Build quality wise, I feel the Sony is a little bit better than the Tamron. It feels a little bit more solid, but having said that, they are both quite plasticky compared to the more expensive professional lenses. Having said that, there's one thing I quite like about the Tamron is that if you look at the rear mount here, they use some more special kind of material here for the rear mount, which not only make it look more premium, but I think it probably would help reduce the lens flare a little bit, which we're going to look at a little bit later in this review. In comparison to the Sony, which just use a more very plastic, very cheap kind of plastic for the rear mount, which is typically what you see on most of the consumer lenses. In terms of the size, the two lenses are quite similar. I guess the biggest difference is the Sony is quite a bit wider or fatter lens compared to the Tamron, and both lenses would extend when you try to zoom in, and when they are both fully extended, the height is also very similar. The Sony is only slightly taller than the Tamron. The Sony has a 72mm front filter thread, while the Tamron is 67mm, which is the same for all the f2.8 zoom lenses for the Sony E-mount, and also the f2.8 prime lenses for the E-mount are also 67mm, so it is quite handy if you got more than one of the lenses so that you can easily share the filter between those lenses. One of the biggest difference between these two lenses is the focal length range. With the Sony, it goes from 24mm all the way to 240mm, while with the Tamron, it goes from 28mm to 200mm. So the Tamron doesn't go quite as wide, and also the telephoto end is a little bit shorter. And to give you some idea what's the actual difference, here are 4 different photos I've shot with these two lenses at the widest and the most telephoto end. So you can see with the 24 and the 28, there is quite a bit of difference, and also the telephoto end, the Sony can go a little bit further. To me personally, I don't mind too much that the telephoto is a little bit shorter, because I feel like the camera these days, the resolution is so high, you can always just crop a little bit if you feel the telephoto end is not quite enough. But for the wide end, I feel the Sony with its 24mm wide end does offer some advantage over the Tamron. Like I said in my recent Panasonic 2060 review, I really appreciate when the wide end can go wider, because sometimes when the lens is not wide enough and if you want to capture a little bit wider, it is a lot more hassle. You can take multiple photos and merge them together, but it's not quite as easy as compared to you just crop the photo a little bit. But of course, there are many reasons why Tamron chose to go for 28 instead of 24. For example, if you want to buy the ultra wide angle zoom lens, which is 17-28, which I have done a review, check out the link somewhere, I put it below. If you buy those two lenses together, then it will give you a super wide focal length range from 17 all the way to 200. But then there is another big reason, or I should say a big advantage with this Tamron lens, is that its maximum aperture is f2.8 at the wide end, and at the telephoto end is f5.6. So maximum aperture f2.8 on a super zoom lens is something unheard of. Even at the telephoto end, f5.6 is still quite a bit better than most of the super zoom lens in the market. Compare that with the Sony, it is f3.5 at the wide end and f6.3 at the telephoto end. So if you look at the numbers, it is about 1/3 to 1/2 stop faster than the Sony, depends on which end you look at, but just look at the number, it's just half the story. If you actually compare the maximum aperture at the different focal length, I plot a chart here that show you the maximum aperture of these two lenses as you changing through the different focal length. You can see that the maximum aperture for the Sony lens would decrease quite quickly as soon as you start to zoom in, while with the Tamron lens it managed to keep its maximum aperture at the larger value or the smaller number for quite a bit longer compared to the Sony lens. If you look at the chart, you can see that at some of the focal length, the Tamron is like one stop faster than the Sony, so that makes a huge difference if you want to take photo under low light, or if you want to minimize the depth of field so that you can blur the background, separate the foreground object from the background. So almost one stop faster is a huge difference between these two very similar size super zoom lens. But there's another thing that is missing from the Tamron is that it doesn't have the optical image stabilizer built into the lens, while the Sony it does have OSS, so it should give you better image stabilization feature. However, most of the latest Sony E-mount camera, they do have a in-body image stabilizer. So I was quite curious to see actually how big is the difference between these two lenses. One would purely depend on the camera's in-body image stabilizer, while the other one that has the optical image stabilizer. So I shot 150 photos at 200mm focal length, 50 of them using the Tamron lens and 50 of them using the Sony lens, and another 50 with the Tamron but with the camera's in-body image stabilizer turned off. And I shot all the photos at the shutter speed of 1/20 seconds. So 1/20 seconds at 200mm, which is pretty much like 1/10 of the normal safe shutter speed that people would normally recommend. And not surprisingly, with the 50 photos that I shot without any image stabilization, 50 photos, only one of them I would consider sharp. Basically, pretty much all the photos shot at that very slow shutter speed is unusable. And when I turn on the in-body image stabilizer, the 50 photos that I shot with the Tamron lens, about 33 photos I consider sharp. So that is pretty good because I got around 66% of success rate when I shoot at such a slow shutter speed. And when I look at the result from the Sony lens, then I got 35 photos out of the 50 photos that I consider sharp. So it is a little bit better than the Tamron, so around 70%, but the difference is actually smaller than what I would expect it. So maybe the lack of the optical image stabilizer with the Tamron is not really a big disadvantage if you compare it with the Sony. Autofocus performance is quite similar between these two lenses. The autofocus speed is reasonably fast when you are shooting under bright sunlight, and the operation itself is also quite quiet. But if you are shooting indoor, very quiet indoor, you may hear the Tamron lens. It does have a little bit louder ticking noise when you doing autofocus. But having said that, the difference is quite minor between these two lenses, and if you are shooting outdoor, you probably wouldn't hear any autofocus noise at all. The Tamron lens seems to have a parfocal design, or very close to it at least, while with the Sony lens, I changed the focal length from the wide end to the telephoto end. I noticed the focus point would change quite a bit. If you like to take close-up photos with the Tamron, you can get the maximum magnification of 1 to 3.1 when you're shooting at the wide end, while with the Sony, the maximum magnification is 1 to 3.7, so that is a little bit lower than the Tamron. But Sony didn't seem to specify at what focal length can you achieve the maximum magnification, and from my own testing it seems like I can get the maximum magnification when I'm shooting at the telephoto end, so that is quite different to the Tamron lens. Okay, now let's have a look at the image quality and start from the image sharpness. At 28mm focal length, with the Tamron lens, if we look at the center sharpness, The center sharpness is already excellent even at the maximum aperture, which is f2.8, and if I stop down to f4, I think the contrast improved a little bit, but sharpness also just improved very marginally. If you stop down further, it doesn't really change much because the lens was already very sharp at f4. If you compare it with the Sony, which the maximum aperture is f4 at 28mm, look at the photos that shot at the same aperture. I think the center sharpness is very similar. Now let's look at the corner at 28mm. With the Tamron at the maximum aperture f2.8, the corner sharpness is, I think it's okay. Stop down to f4 would improve the sharpness quite a bit, and at f5.6 then the corner sharpness become excellent. And now let's look at the Sony. At f4, the corner sharpness is not good at all. It's quite soft. And even if I stop down to f8, the corner sharpness is still not very good. And now let's look at the results I got when shoot at 200mm focal length. With the Tamron lens, even when I shoot at the maximum aperture at 5.6, I think the center sharpness is already very good. So stopping down to f8 would only improve the center sharpness a little bit. And with the Sony lens, the maximum aperture is now f6.3. At 6.3, the center sharpness is not too sharp. Even if I stop down to f8, it is still not very good. If you compare it with the Tamron, I think the Tamron at f5.6 is still sharper than the Sony at f8. And now let's look at the corner. With the Tamron at 5.6, the corner is a little bit soft. If I stop down to f8, then it becomes reasonably sharp. And now let's look at the result from the Sony. At the maximum aperture f6.3, the corner is really soft. And even when I stop down to f8 or even f11, the corner still remains very soft. The result is really quite bad that I actually went and redo the whole test because I was not sure whether I got the correct result or not. But my second test, the result is pretty much the same. So yeah, corner at the 200mm with the Sony is definitely not very good. In terms of distortion, when I turn off the distortion compensation from the camera, the Tamron, there is a little bit of barrel distortion at the wide end, and as I zoom in, then it becomes a bit of pincushion distortion. It's not terrible, but it's noticeable. And when I turn on distortion control, then distortion is not really noticeable throughout the whole focal length range. With the Sony lens, I just couldn't disable the distortion compensation from the camera. That option is grayed out when I mount this Sony lens on. So with that enabled, compare these two side by side, you see virtually no difference because they are both very well corrected by the camera. If you shoot RAW and use the Adobe software, I was told the lens profile for Adobe for the Tamron lens is coming very soon. Because the Tamron lens has a faster maximum aperture throughout the whole focal length range, so when you are shooting with the Tamron lens, you could dissolve the background more than the Sony if you want to shoot at the maximum aperture. But in terms of the bokeh quality, maybe because both lenses, they both have the 7 curved aperture braid design, the actual quality of the bokeh is quite similar. You can see a bit of halo near the edge of the bokeh, and the bokeh itself is probably not perfectly smooth, but overall I think the bokeh quality is okay for a super zoom lens. With the very large zoom range and very complicated optical design, lens flare could be a big problem for super zoom lenses, but surprisingly both the Tamron and Sony, they both have very good lens flare control. No matter shooting into the sun or any bright light source, there is very minimal amount of lens flare or ghosting. But if I have to pick a winner, I would definitely give it to Tamron, because with the Sony lens, sometimes you do get a bit of ghosting, like when you're shooting into the sun. I could see a bit of purplish ghosting, and similar thing when I'm shooting at nighttime and shooting into a bright light, I could see a little bit more ghosting with the Sony lens. In terms of vignetting, at the 28mm focal length, the Sony definitely has less noticeable vignetting when compared to the Tamron. Not too sure if it's because it has a larger front element and larger front filter thread, so it can help minimize the vignetting at the wide end. But yeah, if you look at these two photos, both shot at f4, you can see that the Sony has less vignetting than the Tamron. And now if we look at the telephoto end when shooting at 200mm focal length, both lenses has a little bit of vignetting when shooting at the maximum aperture, but when I stop down to f8, then vignetting is virtually not noticeable with both lenses. If you are a landscape photographer and love to have sun stars in your landscape photos, I would say both lenses, they don't give you very beautiful sun star even if you stop down the aperture to a very small value. Comparing the photos that I've shot at the same aperture, I say the sun star from the Tamron looks a little bit better. But on the other hand, the Sony does have a bit of advantage because you can stop down to f25, while with the Tamron you can only stop down to f16. I remember when I bought my first DSLR, I was looking at buying the Tamron 18-200 super zoom lens because back in those days that was a very popular super zoom lens because of its compact size and good value for money and pretty decent image quality. And then Tamron released the 16-300 a couple of years later, and then 18-400. So you can see the trend is they are chasing for the bigger and bigger focal length range, but at the same time the lens is also getting a bit bigger and heavier. But recently when Tamron created the zoom lenses for the Sony E9 cameras, they seems to choose a completely opposite strategy. Look at the 17-28 2.8, 28-75, and then the 70-180 2.8 lenses. The focal length range is not quite as wide as the other competitor in the market, but in return, they have a lens that is quite a bit smaller, lighter, a little bit more affordable, while at the same time they deliver very good image quality. And they use the same kind of philosophy to create this Tamron 28-200 super zoom lens. And the result is a very compact, very lightweight, and also affordable lens. But the most important thing is the image quality is excellent. The image sharpness is very good from the wide end also to the telephoto end, and from center all the way to the corner. Look at my comparison photos with the Sony. You can see the Sony is definitely not quite as good, especially if you look at the corner sharpness or the performance at the telephoto end. And remember, the Tamron also has faster aperture throughout the whole focal length range. At some of the aperture is even one stop faster. So what that means is that if you are taking photo in real world, the Tamron, you should be able to get quite a bit better image quality because you can shoot at faster aperture compared to the Sony, and with the Sony, you really have to stop down quite a bit if you want to match the image quality of the Tamron. So you'll be shooting at a slower aperture. That means you probably have to bump up the ISO quite a bit, which would also have impact on the image quality. Because of that, I feel the Tamron 28-200 is almost the perfect travel lens. I say almost perfect because I do still really wish the Tamron can go a little bit wider to 24mm. But look at the result. Consider the size, the price, and the image quality. I feel this is one of the compromises that I'm happy to accept. And if I really got a chance to travel with this Tamron lens, I think what I will do is that I will also pick up the Tamron 20mm f2.8 lens as my secondary lens. So I would use that Tamron 20mm lens, which is a very compact and affordable prime lens, for my ultra wide angle shots.